So Genesis begins with its first characters being the first civilizations. And that's what we've been saying, is that men are nations and women are the cultures that they had. And hopefully I was able to demonstrate that with Sumer and Akkad. But, maybe that's a little... There's nothing groundbreaking about that. I believe what I said is unique and interesting, but you could say, well, that's the past, and even people from the past had a past, and they were just remembering their past in story form. That's a fair point. But I think I should explain to you, from what I can tell, how the actual Bible works. And I have no idea how this happened. I have zero idea. I have no idea. Imagine Genesis, the whole book, is like a summary of the whole history of the past 5,000-6,000 years, mostly focused on Western civilization. So Noah, we ended Noah. They leave the ark, and I said that was the end of the Akkadian Empire. Well, that just so happens to correspond with the time that's called 4.2 kiloyear event. And that goes on until the Bronze Age collapse. So that period of time of the 4.2 kiloyear event to the Bronze Age collapse, and all the history that happens inside of that, that's called Abraham. So Abraham has a son, the son of his old age. And his name is Isaac. Now, Isaac is not like Abraham, because the problem with Abraham, or the problem with explaining Abraham, is Abraham starts as Abram, and it's Abram that does the wandering. And so Abram represents sort of a movement of power supremacy in the Mediterranean area, and then it falls finally on his taking on the final role, the final country of, and I'll prove this, of the Mycenean Greece, which is what it is. It's strange, it's something you probably don't even really have a good feeling for what Mycenean Greece is, but that's my contention. And then you hit something called the Bronze Age collapse. And then you hit something called the Bronze Age collapse. And that is this mysterious point of history where the exact details are sort of lost to history. Simultaneously, almost all, but not all, many of the civilizations of the Mediterranean kind of Middle East area all collapse simultaneously. There's an invasion by a sort of mysterious group called the Sea People, and much of the known world, the civilized world at that time, is literally burnt to the ground, and they call it the Greek Dark Ages, and everything just sort of stops. But then it picks up about 800 BC. Suddenly you're in Greece. Suddenly you're in Isaac. And the whole world becomes very Hellenized. And that lasts until the Greeks collapse under their own hubris, and the Romans come to power. That is when Isaac's son Jacob and his twin brother Esau come into power. So Jacob represents the Roman Empire before it split up between the East and the West, and the West falls, but the East continues on until Jacob meets Esau. Until you have these two twins of the Roman Catholic Christian world meeting the Islamic Muslim world. And then Jacob returns to the land of his father. He goes back to Europe, and he has with his 12 sons, and those 12 sons become Europe. And one of those sons is Joesph. And Genesis picks up the story of Joesph over his other brothers. They're in there, but it is mostly focused on Joesph. Well, Joesph is sold into slavery and sent to Egypt. And Joesph, I told you I don't understand this, is America. And Egypt represents democracy. And Joesph has 2 sons. Their names are Ephriam and Manasseh. And so democracy gives birth to 2 sons, twins again. Capitalism and communism or socialism. Now, socialism was older by a little bit, but the capitalism was more preferred and got the blessing. They both became great nations, but Ephraim more than Manasseh. And then Joesph dies, and thus ends the book of Genesis. And so Genesis takes you from the advent of civilization through World War II, post-World War II, until Joesph dies. The Egyptians begin to multiply, and a new pharaoh who doesn't remember Joesph comes into power. And so the strangest thing is you turn the page at the end of Genesis and you start the book of Exodus. Now, Exodus is the story of leaving Egypt. And escaping the grasp of Pharaoh. The evil Pharaoh, not the one that made Joseph second in command. You know, like a prime minister or an elected official. And so the strange part becomes, because they tell a story, the Genesis is always the beginning of all the stories, but yet, at least from the point of view that I think I can make a pretty good case for this, that somehow Genesis is the whole story, and Exodus appears to be the end of the story. But the traditional understanding is that it's Revelation that's the end of the story. That's the part that is unfulfilled. But I'll make the claim that Revelation is mostly fulfilled. Like all but the last little bit. But here's the problem. Where's Jesus? I just told that whole story and there's no... But there is a Jesus. Because obviously, if you're a man, any man, even the Son of God, you're not God. You're his son. But who's Jesus? And did he die on a cross? Can I prove it? Did he take on the sins of the whole world and become hated by all men? Was the veil of the temple torn in two upon his death? Was he born on Christmas Day? Did he come right after John the Baptist? Did he begin his missions and gather his disciples to him? Did he perform miracles? Did he ride into town on a donkey? Was he arrested and beaten and hung on a cross? Did he die and then rise 3 days later? If all this is non-traditional, right, I have invoked the literal nation of Israel 0 times, so we are not talking about what is understood as the traditional Holy Land here. Now, when I say I think this book is unbelievably accurate, it's unbelievably accurate. It makes me sound like an unbelievable crackpot. I am fully aware of what this does. But here's the thing again. We've never been asked to look at it ourselves. And I did. And this is... It has become so obvious to me that I can almost no longer engage in any form of discussion about this thing with anybody. I can no longer sit in a church in good faith. Not that I did much. I see it everywhere. I can show you what the entire book of Revelation means and how every single piece of every single story lines up. But you're going, well, what about the rest of the Bible? It's real simple. It's real simple. From about Joshua to the end of the Old Testament, it's for the most part giving you the history of the Greeks. And the New Testament, for the most part, is a history of the Romans. I mean, hell, one of their books is called Romans. Like, nobody ever really thinks about this stuff, but Paul went on his 5 missions, or 4 missions, and then a 5th where he died. He died in the year 66 AD. Rome was burnt to the ground in 66 AD. Nero was chased out of town as a scoundrel in 66 AD. Jerusalem was burnt to the ground after a massive fight. A massive, ugly fight in 66 AD. The temple, like the rest of the Bible, it's not literal. It's a representation, like the ark, of where God lives. There was the first temple, there was the second temple, and there is currently already existing in perfect detail, according to the book of Ezekiel, that already is there, and you can go walk around it and take photographs. So now when you hear this and you go back and you actually listen to what I'm saying, all of these things build this story. And I told you this started with the book of Revelation, but I can't tell you the book of Revelation until you understand that when I drop you right in the middle of the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, that it's not a fluke and it's not an accident. And when I take you through World War II and the advent of electricity and motion pictures. So there's this notion, I think one of the big complaints about the Bible, and it was one of my complaints, is that it's an old book about old times that is really only relevant to a tiny sliver of land of people I couldn't really give a shit about. And it, like, if you really thought about it, it wasn't, like, how could this important God just ignore all of humanity except for a little tiny piece? Which really was always a stretch to believe that King David was the most powerful king in the area and that Solomon was the wisest man that's ever lived. Well, who is King David? This little shepherd boy that went against a giant that created the nation of Israel? There's not even the tiniest shred of evidence for his existence. There's like one inscription somewhere that kind of mentions the house of David. That's it. That's the grand total. And yet we're supposed to believe that. And it's underwhelming. But yet I can show you a tiny Greek culture that stood face to face in pure defiance of the world's largest, most powerful army and said, "Let's go, big boy," and crushed him and killed him and cut off his head and became a united Israel. And that's another word that's commonly misunderstood. And when Alexander the Great defeated the Persian Empire and went on to conquer most of the known world, he's called Alexander the Great in the city of David. Right, is named after David. But this city of Alexandria is named after Alexander and his son, Solomon. The Ptolemaics, after a struggle for power after the king's death, did in fact become the wisest man in the world. The great library of Alexandria, where everybody all over the world came to study and learn. But it doesn't work if you're looking for a single person. But holy shit if you understand that it's a man. And the rest of the Bible, once you learn to read the words, it makes you realize there's a kick-ass story that's been right there the whole time. And thank God it was spread the way it was, because when people finally understand it, it'll blow your mind. So yeah, I'll tell you what the trumpets are, and I'll tell you what the bowls are, and I'll tell you about the locusts that come up out of the ground. Like, we haven't even scratched the surface of what this book is actually saying. And if I look like a madman, have you seen the world lately? Everybody looks like a madman. What's one more who might accidentally sprinkle you with a little hope, inspiration, and remind you literally live in an inexplicable place, and we forget that with all our silly commercials and our goofiness, that this is no joke. This is actually happening. And why wouldn't it be a little amazing from time to time? So, I just thought maybe you needed to hear where I'm going, because, otherwise it's just a bunch of noise.